Hello and welcome. Today we are going to be making Snickerdoodles. These, while looking and smelling similar to a sugar cookie, actually have a nice contrast in flavor coming from the cream of tartar. I'll talk about that more while we're mixing that up though. First, as always, I'd like to thank everyone who is watching and sharing these videos. It's a huge help in growing the channel and it means the world to me. And if you haven't already subscribed, subscribe, and if you hit the notification bell, YouTube might tell you about a new video if the moon's right and the stars align. For our ingredients, we will need 2 3/4 cups all-purpose flour, 1 1/2 cups sugar, 2 teaspoons cream of tartar, 2 medium or large eggs, 1/2 cup vegetable shortening softened, 1/2 cup butter or vegan spread also softened. Margarine does not work in this case. 1/4 teaspoon salt and 1 teaspoon baking soda. For our coating, we will just need cinnamon and sugar. In this case, 1/4 cup sugar and 1 teaspoon cinnamon. Now we begin with the wet ingredients in our sugar. We want to combine our eggs, shortening, butter, and sugar until most of the shortening and butter are fully incorporated into the mix. You can still have a few clumps here and there. They will go away when you mix the dry ingredients in. The reason we want to mix it first is to make sure the butter and the shortening come together. They can be a bit difficult to make sure they're evenly dispersed into the mix if you don't do it at this time. The sugar, once melted, will almost act like a liquid instead of a solid mass, so this is the perfect time to add that as well. Zipping ahead, once it looks like this, you are golden and we can get on with our dry ingredients. Okay, so as always when baking, I like to mix my dry ingredients before adding the wet. So in this, that goes the flour, salt, baking soda, and the star of the show, cream of tartar. So since you may be unfamiliar with cream of tartar, and it does so much work in this recipe, let's talk about that for a moment. Cream of tartar is a powdered form of tartaric acid. This is what's going to be activating in the baking soda and giving it a rise to make bubbles. But it actually does more than that. It's also going to prevent sugar crystals from forming, and that's going to keep the cookies softer for longer. As well as that, it's also going to add a very slight tanginess and unfortunately a very small, very slight metallic taste as well. Since it's ground so fine, we need to pre-mix it just to make sure none of it clumps, because finely ground powders tend to clump pretty badly. So as long as we pre-mix it, we can avoid that, and that's why we do that. So now that we're done mixing, let's do some more mixing. You don't have to worry about being slow or anything, just dump the liquid right in and start mixing. It will kind of ironically behave a bit more like a bread dough and form a shaggy dough before coming together. Purely from habit, I kind of end up folding everything together slowly, but you don't actually need to do that. There's no bubbles to be knocked out at this point. You just want to make sure everything gets incorporated. You're probably going to have to knead some of the more stubborn pieces in when you start to get towards the very last bits of it. So once you do get those worked in and everything's mixed into a nice ball, you'll want to rest it for about 10 minutes or so just to let the dough relax, and that'll make it easier to form a ball, and it also happens to help give our dough a little bit more time to come up to room temperature. Once we've rested it for a few minutes, we are ready to roll them into dough balls. As I'm awkwardly demonstrating, we want to form our dough into a ball. You don't need to be exact in the ball size, but you do want them kind of roughly the same size so that they're going to cook at about the same time. That'll prevent one from being super dry and one from being perfect, and you definitely don't want that. Since this dough can be a little bit crumbly, you're going to want to compress the outsides with your fingers and kind of push them into that rough dough shape first and have it kind of sticking together. And then you can roll it in your palm and make it round, or you can just leave it a little bit rougher in shape. If you do leave it a little rougher in shape, watch out that some pieces don't end up getting too thin, because if they do, they'll end up very crispy and so different in texture that people won't quite understand why it's that texture in that spot. Once we have our dough made into balls, we're almost ready to coat them. I'm going to give the cinnamon and sugar a quick mix to make sure the cinnamon's evenly spread out, and then we can get on to rolling our dough balls into the sugar mixture. Cinnamon in this case will be one of our primary flavors, since rolling it on the outside means it hits your taste buds as soon as you take a bite, and then it will linger for the rest of the bite. This comboed with the cream of tartar are responsible for the classic Snickerdoodle taste. Once mixed, we just need to roll the balls in our cinnamon and sugar mixture. Since this dough is a bit dry, you're going to need to apply a small amount of downward pressure while you're rolling this to get a nice even coating. You'll probably have about half of the cinnamon and sugar mixture left over. I tend to just put it in a container and dust it on either other sweet baked goods or just use it in coffee, things like that. Once they are covered, they should go into an oven preheated to 400 degrees to bake for 9 to 12 minutes. I tried this a few times and found 9 minutes was just barely enough time to get fully cooked unless your dough was already at room temperature. At roughly 9 to 9.5 minutes, you will see them start to rise at a slightly faster pace. We want to let them rise at this faster pace for about a minute to a minute and a half. At that point, we want to take them out and let them cool while covered with either a light towel or some paper towels to keep in the moisture and make sure that they don't dry out any more than they have to. This will help them keep softer for longer as well. I tested the cookies spread with a Silpat, an ungreased baking sheet, and a parchment paper. None of these created drastically different spreading. Out of all three, though, the parchment was the best one for the spread. It let it slide out a little bit and get wider, but it also didn't make it flat. The ungreased baking sheet browned the bottom of the cookies, but it wasn't quite enough to actually add any flavor. The Silpat just begins to spread a little too much if the ingredients are at room temperature, but if they aren't, it actually works fine. But for pretty much everybody, you're probably going to want to use parchment paper since it spreads the best and it also makes cleanup a breeze. Oh, I would also like to mention that these typically will stay fresh for about 2 days or so. If you need them longer than that, you can place a half a slice of bread into whatever container you're storing them in, and it'll help them stay longer. But much past 5 days and they start to kind of become hockey pucks no matter how much effort you put into keeping them moist. Looking at our 3 cookies side by side, they look pretty much the same and also are almost the same height. I would guess my dough was just under room temperature, so about 64 degrees or so. I think if the mixture had been less dry or hotter, you would have seen significantly more spreading on the Silpat, while the parchment and the bare one would probably still fare okay. But if it does tend to be a little bit warmer where you're at, you definitely want to not use a Silpat. Once you have cooled off your cookies, you have now made a classic version of the Snickerdoodle. This recipe was a bit older, and one thing I did have to substitute was shortening for the lard that it called for. They were both pretty much the same. No matter which one you used, the cookies turned out pretty much the same. But the shortening doesn't have a bunch of people going, ew, lard. So, shortening's an easier one. Use that. And with that, I would like to thank you all for watching, and I hope you all have a great day and a great meal.